264 years before the birth of Christ, in the Forum Boarium, the cattle market of Rome, something happened that would echo through 7 centuries of history. 3 pairs of men stood facing one another, armed with swords and shields. They were slaves, condemned criminals perhaps, men whose names have been lost to time. But their purpose that day was clear. They would fight, they would bleed, and some of them would die. This was not war. This was not execution. This was theatre. The Brutus brothers had arranged this spectacle to honour their father's memory, following what they claimed was an ancient Etruscan tradition. Funeral games, they called them, a blood offering to appease the dead. But something else was happening here, something the brothers understood perfectly well. Every prominent Roman family was watching. Every ambitious politician was taking note, and the common people of Rome, they were transfixed. Consider for a moment what the crowd saw. Not the chaos of battle, but something choreographed. Not random violence, but skill. These men had been trained. They knew how to move, how to strike, how to make death into performance. When blade met flesh, when blood darkened the sand, when one man fell and another stood triumphant, something awakened in the watching crowd, a hunger that would never quite be satisfied. The Brutus brothers were not simply mourning their father. They were announcing their family's wealth, their generosity, their worthiness for public office. They were investing in their political future, and the currency they chose was human life. It worked brilliantly. Within decades, the pattern had established itself. Ambitious men climbing Rome's political ladder, the cursus honorum, that carefully structured sequence of offices that led to power, discovered that staging games could accelerate their ascent more effectively than speeches or policy proposals. The people voted with their memories of spectacle. They remembered who had given them the finest shows, the most thrilling combats, the most generous entertainments. And when election time came, they repaid that generosity with their support. This was democracy in action, though perhaps not as philosophers envisioned it. The games became a conversation between rulers and ruled, a transaction made in blood and sand. The ambitious provided entertainment. The masses provided political power. Everyone understood the terms. Julius Caesar understood better than most. In 65 BC, serving as aedile, the official responsible for public games and infrastructure, Caesar staged combats featuring 320 pairs of gladiators. 320 pairs. Imagine witnessing this. 640 men fighting in silver armor that caught the Roman sun and threw light across the forum. The expense was staggering. The spectacle was unprecedented. The political impact was exactly what Caesar intended. The Senate understood what he was doing. They watched this young aristocrat buying popularity wholesale, purchasing the devotion of Rome's urban poor with borrowed money and borrowed lives. They saw the future he was building, and it terrified them. Within months, they passed laws limiting how much any individual could spend on gladiatorial games, capping the number of fighters that could be displayed. But laws passed in fear rarely succeed. By the time Caesar crossed the Rubicon River in 49 BC, declaring civil war against the Republic itself, the urban masses stood firmly in his camp. They remembered those silver-armored gladiators. They remembered his generosity. And when the choice came between Caesar and the Senate, between the man who had entertained them and the institution that had restricted that entertainment, their loyalty was never in doubt. This is what the games had become, a tool of such political power that it could topple republics. After Caesar's assassination, after the civil wars that followed, after the dust settled and Octavian emerged as Augustus, Rome's first emperor, the system crystallized into something permanent. Augustus was perhaps the most calculating politician Rome ever produced. He understood that the games served 3 crucial functions: three pillars upon which imperial stability could rest. First, they demonstrated imperial generosity. An emperor who staged magnificent games was sharing the wealth of empire with the people. He was, in effect, saying, "I conquered distant lands, I filled the treasury, and now I give back to you." This was the fundamental bargain of Roman imperial rule. Expansion abroad financed entertainment at home. Second, they provided what we might call a safety valve for urban discontent. Rome was a city of perhaps 1 million people, many of them poor, many without steady work, all crowded into apartment blocks that would occasionally collapse or burn. These were people with grievances, with energy, with the potential for riot or rebellion. The games channeled that energy into controlled enthusiasm. They gave the masses something to anticipate, to argue about, to remember. Bread and circuses, the saying went, keep their stomachs full and their eyes entertained, and political unrest becomes far less likely. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the games reinforced hierarchy through the spectacle of power over life and death. Every combat demonstrated a fundamental truth of Roman society. Some people have absolute power over others. The lanista, the gladiator owner, decided who fought. The crowd could call for mercy or death. The emperor, when present, made the final decision with a gesture of his thumb. This was not entertainment alone. This was a lesson in how Rome worked, taught over and over until it became truth deeper than conscious thought. Augustus formalized all of this. He restricted who could stage games, ensuring that this powerful tool remained in imperial hands. No more would ambitious politicians compete to outdo each other's spectacles. No more would private wealth translate directly into political power through the arena. The games became official state policy, subsidized from the imperial treasury, scheduled according to the calendar, as much a part of Roman government as legions or law courts or tax collectors. Perhaps more so, because legions could secure borders, but they could not secure loyalty in quite the same way. Laws could maintain order, but they could not inspire devotion. Taxes could fund the state, but they made no one grateful. The games did something different. They made power seem generous. They transformed imperial dominance into imperial gift-giving. They allowed emperors to appear simultaneously as masters of life and death, and as benefactors sharing that mastery with the people. This was governance through spectacle, and it proved remarkably effective. Consider the logistics required to make this system work. Gladiators had to be acquired through the slave markets, through prisoners of war, through the condemnation of criminals. They had to be housed in training schools, the ludi, where specialized facilities could accommodate hundreds of fighters. They needed trainers, often retired gladiators themselves, men who knew every technique, every weapon type, every style of combat. They required medical staff capable of treating wounds that would kill ordinary men, physicians who understood how to save lives that needed to fight again. They demanded weapons, armor, maintenance, food calculated to build muscle and endurance. And all of this represented investment. These men were property, assets that generated value through public performance. Their owners, the lanistae, ran what were effectively specialized businesses, renting out trained fighters to whoever could pay the fee. Some lanistae became wealthy beyond measure, their names appearing on inscriptions alongside senators and merchants, their status rising through proximity to death. The gladiators themselves existed in a strange paradox. They were slaves, the lowest legal status in Roman society. But successful fighters could become famous, celebrated, desired. Their images appeared on oil lamps and pottery. Women of noble birth supposedly risked scandal for their company. Children played games imitating their styles. They were simultaneously despised and adored, property and heroes, merchandise and myths. A gladiator who survived long enough could earn his freedom the wooden sword called a rudis, presented by the editor of the games as reward for exceptional courage or skill. Freedom did not erase the brand of infamia that marked anyone who had fought for entertainment, but it meant choice. Some freed gladiators became trainers, teaching what they had learned through survival. Others became bodyguards, their combat skills valuable in Rome's dangerous streets. A few even became Lannistae themselves, moving from merchandise to merchant, from property to property owner. But most did not live long enough to be freed. The average gladiator fought perhaps 5 to 10 times before death or crippling injury ended his career. The odds improved with experience. Novices died far more frequently than veterans, but chance always played its role. A slip in blood-slicked sand, a moment's inattention, a lucky thrust by an opponent. The games consumed lives steadily, a furnace that required constant feeding. This created what economists would recognize as a market. Supply and demand, price discovery, competitive advantage. Lannistae competed to acquire the most promising fighters and train them most effectively. Editors of games competed to stage the most memorable spectacles. Gladiators competed for survival, for fame, for the possibility of freedom. The whole system hummed with transactions, with calculations of value and risk and reward. It was brutal. It was efficient. And it was, by Roman standards, perfectly normal. We might be tempted to judge this harshly, to see it as evidence of Roman barbarism or moral corruption. But the Romans would have found our judgment puzzling. They saw the games as serving legitimate purposes, honoring the gods, demonstrating courage, entertaining citizens, maintaining order. They saw nothing wrong with making use of criminals and slaves who would die anyway. Better, they thought, to let them die with purpose, with skill, with the chance for honor. Better to make their deaths meaningful through performance than to simply execute them in darkness. This was the logic of the system. This was its self-justification, and for centuries it worked precisely as designed. By the end of Augustus's reign in 14 AD, the gladiatorial games had become as much a part of Roman life as the Senate, or the legions, or the temples. They were woven into the calendar of festivals, anticipated throughout the year, discussed endlessly in taverns and bathhouses and homes. They were how Rome celebrated military victories, how emperors marked their accessions, how provinces demonstrated their civilization and their loyalty to Rome. The infrastructure had been built, both the physical infrastructure of amphitheaters spreading across the empire, and the social infrastructure of expectations and traditions and meanings. The games now had momentum. They had become, in a very real sense, necessary, not for survival, but for how Romans understood themselves, their society, their place in the world. What had begun in 264 BC as a funeral rite performed by two brothers had transformed into an institution that would outlast the Republic, survive the empire's conversion to Christianity, and continue until the very foundations of Roman civilization crumbled. But standing in the Forum Boarium in that first moment, watching those first 3 pairs of fighters, no one could have predicted this. No one imagined that 7 centuries later, in the ruins of the greatest arena ever built, seeds carried in the fur of long-dead exotic animals would sprout into gardens, turning death into life, transforming slaughter into beauty. That story begins here, with blood on sand and ambition in hearts, with the realization that death could be useful, that violence could be beautiful, that power and entertainment could merge into something both terrible and irresistible. The crowd at the Forum Boarium that day watched men die and wanted more. Rome would give them more than they could possibly imagine, more than we, looking back across the centuries, can quite comprehend. The games had begun, and they would not end until Rome itself ended. But that ending lay centuries ahead. For now, there was only the beginning, only the first blood on sand, the first cheers from a crowd, the first realization that this strange new entertainment could reshape the political landscape of an entire civilization. The Brutus brothers had intended to honor their father. Instead, they had created something that would outlive empires. Behind every gladiator who stepped into the arena, behind every roar of the crowd, behind every moment of courage or desperation or death, there existed a web of economic calculations so intricate, so sophisticated, that it would not seem out of place in a modern corporation. The games were not simply spectacle. They were industry. At the apex of this industry sat the Lannistae, the gladiator, managers and owners who transformed human beings into profitable assets. These were men who understood that violence, properly organized, could generate extraordinary wealth. They were entrepreneurs of death, and the most successful among them became as rich as senators. Consider the business model. A Lannister might purchase a slave at market for 500 to 1,000 denarii, perhaps the price of a decent horse or a year's rent for a modest apartment. This slave might be a prisoner of war, a criminal condemned to the arena, or simply someone sold into bondage by debt or misfortune. Raw material, in economic terms, potential value not yet realized. The Lannister would then invest in transformation. He would house this slave in a ludus, a gladiatorial school that was part prison, part training facility, part business headquarters. He would feed him not luxuriously, but substantially. Gladiators needed strength, needed muscle, needed endurance. Their diet was heavy in barley, beans, and ash drinks, designed to build bulk and padding that might protect vital organs from blade strikes. Some archaeologists examining gladiator remains have found evidence of what they call subcutaneous fat armor, deliberate weight gain to create a protective layer beneath the skin. He would assign trainers, doctors who specialized in different fighting styles. The Murmillo with his large rectangular shield and gladius sword, the Thraex with his small square shield and curved psyker blade, the Retiarius with his net and trident, fighting unarmored, relying on speed and distance, the Hoplomachus styled after Greek hoplites, the Equites who fought on horseback before dismounting for close combat. Each style required years to master. Each demanded different physical attributes and tactical thinking. He would provide medical care. This was not mercy, this was investment protection. A gladiator represented capital, and dead capital generates no return. The most successful Lannistae employed the finest physicians available. In Pergamon, a young Greek doctor named Galen won the contract to treat gladiators by proposing innovative techniques for wound management. In his first 4 years, he reduced mortality among injured fighters from 60% to 5%, 60 to 5. Think about what this meant for a Lannister's bottom line. Instead of losing more than half his wounded fighters to infection and complications, he kept 95% of them alive to fight again. Galen's medical innovations were driven by economic incentive as much as humanitarian concern. He needed results that could be measured in survival rates and profit margins. After this investment in acquisition, housing, feeding, training, and medical care, an investment that might total 2,000 to 3,000 denarii per gladiator, the Lannister possessed an asset that could generate remarkable returns. A trained gladiator rented out for a munus could command 1,500 to 2,000 denarii per fight. If the fighter survived, the Lannister could rent him out again and again. Over a career of perhaps 5 to 10 fights, a single successful gladiator might generate 10,000 to 15,000 denarii in rental fees. The mathematics becomes clear. Initial investment, 3,000 denarii. Potential gross revenue, 15,000 denarii. Net profit, 12,000 denarii. assuming the Gladiator survived long enough. A 400% return on investment, achieved over perhaps 3 to 5 years. Of course, the risk was always death. A gladiator killed in the arena represented not just lost future revenue, but sunk costs that would never be recovered. This is why, despite what dramatic modern retellings might suggest, most gladiatorial combats did not end in death. The editor of the games, the sponsor who was paying rental fees, did not want to pay the additional penalty for a killed fighter. That penalty could be substantial, the full replacement value of the gladiator, sometimes double or triple the rental fee. It was cheaper to let the loser live. This created an interesting dynamic. The crowd might cry for death, but the editor was doing mental arithmetic. The defeated gladiator's owner certainly wanted his property preserved. So the famous gesture thumb up or down, or however it was actually performed, the historical evidence remains ambiguous, was not simply about mercy or cruelty. It was about economics. Death was expensive. Victory was entertainment. But survival was good business. Some gladiators became so valuable that Lannister insured them, paying fees to syndicates who would cover losses if the fighter died. We have records of these insurance contracts, evidence of a sophisticated financial system built around human combat. Risk management applied to lives that had already been stripped of freedom. The most successful Lannister built small empires. Gnaeus Aurelius Scaurus of Pompeii left inscriptions boasting of his gladiatorial familia, the term used for a Lannister's stable of fighters, borrowed from the word for family, which tells us something about how Romans conceptualized these business relationships. Scaurus was wealthy enough to serve as a magistrate, to fund public building projects, to have his name carved in stone alongside the city's most prominent citizens. His wealth came from managing men who fought for their lives while he collected fees and calculated margins. But Lannister represented only one layer of this economic ecosystem. Above them sat the editors of games, the politicians, the emperors, the provincial governors who actually staged the spectacles. For these men, the economics worked differently. They were not seeking profit. They were purchasing something more valuable than money. They were buying political power, public loyalty, and prestige. The costs they faced were staggering. A modest munus featuring 20 to 30 pairs of gladiators might cost 50,000 to 100,000 denarii, enough to purchase a large farm or several urban apartment buildings. An elaborate imperial spectacle could consume millions. When Trajan celebrated his Dacian triumph in 107 AD with 123 days of games, the costs reportedly exceeded 100 million denarii. 100 million denarii. To put this in perspective, a Roman legionary earned 900 denarii per year. Trajan's games cost more than the annual salary of 111,000 soldiers. It was wealth on a scale that defies easy comprehension. Wealth extracted from conquered Dacia in the form of gold and slaves and tribute, now being redistributed to the Roman people through the medium of organized slaughter. But Trajan was not being foolish. He was investing in legitimacy. Those games said to every Roman, "I conquered for you. I fought for you. The wealth of empire flows to you through my generosity." When soldiers in distant provinces heard about those games, they understood that their emperor rewarded loyalty spectacularly. When potential rebels calculated the odds of success, they had to weigh their grievances against the fact that this emperor commanded resources sufficient to stage 123 consecutive days of entertainment. The political dividend was enormous. Trajan became one of Rome's most beloved emperors, his reign remembered as a golden age. The games were not an expense, they were an investment that paid returns in stability, loyalty, and historical reputation. Provincial governors faced similar calculations on a smaller scale. A governor arriving in a new province might stage games to demonstrate imperial generosity and secure local cooperation. The costs came from his own pocket, or from the provincial treasury he controlled, or from contributions he extracted from local elites who understood that generosity to the games meant favor from the governor. This was a system of circulating wealth and obligation, with gladiatorial blood serving as the medium of exchange. Supporting this entire structure was a vast supply chain that employed thousands and generated wealth across the empire. Consider the procurement of beasts for the Venationes, the animal hunts that typically preceded gladiatorial combats. Traders operating in Africa captured lions, leopards, elephants, and ostriches. Traders in Asia secured tigers, bears, and exotic deer. Traders in Germany and Gaul provided aurochs, wild boar, and wolves. These animals had to be captured, without killing them, transported to ports, shipped across the Mediterranean, moved overland to wherever the games were being staged, and kept alive and dangerous until their moment in the arena. This required infrastructure, ships designed to carry wild animals, cages that could contain them, handlers who understood animal behavior well enough to feed lions without becoming food themselves, veterinarians who could keep exotic creatures alive in climates they were never meant to inhabit. All of these people earned their living from the games, depended on the games, had economic interests aligned with the game's continuation. Weapons manufacturers produced specialized equipment found nowhere else. The gladius sword, the trident, the weighted net, the various styles of helmets designed to protect while still allowing the crowd to see the fighter's face and reactions. These were not mass-produced military equipment but custom pieces, often decorated, built to standards that balanced safety with spectacle. Workshops specialized in arena equipment, and their craftsmen commanded premium prices for specialized knowledge. The amphitheaters themselves required constant maintenance. Stone weathers, wood rots. The mechanisms that operated the trapdoors and elevators in the arena floor were complex machines requiring skilled engineers to maintain and operate. Local governments employed permanent staff to manage these facilities not just for games but for the building itself, which represented a major civic asset. Vendors served the crowds, food sellers working the aisles, drink merchants, cushion rental for those sitting on hard stone benches, vendors selling small tokens or images of famous gladiators, bookmakers taking bets on fight outcomes. Gambling was officially illegal but universally practiced, and the money changing hands on any given day of games might exceed the official costs of staging them. All of these people, the lanistei and trainers, the beast traders and handlers, the weapons, smiths and engineers, the vendors and bookmakers, all of them had a stake in the game's continuing. This created political inertia. Any attempt to end or even significantly restrict the games threatened thousands of livelihoods across the empire. Economic systems, once established, resist change, not through malice, but through the simple fact that many people depend on them for survival. Cities competed to build amphitheaters, viewing them as economic investments that would attract visitors and generate revenue. A city with a fine amphitheater could host regional games, drawing crowds from surrounding territories who would spend money on lodging, food, and local goods. The amphitheater became an economic engine for urban development, a driver of what we might call the entertainment economy. Pompeii, before Vesuvius buried it in 79 AD, had an amphitheater that could seat 20,000 people more than the city's entire population. This was not vanity but calculation. Regional games brought visitors from across Campania. Those visitors needed places to stay, food to eat, entertainment beyond the arena. They represented an influx of wealth, and the city's economy adapted to capture that wealth. Inns clustered near the amphitheater, restaurants and taverns multiplied, prostitutes worked the crowds, an entire service economy emerged, to extract money from people who had come to watch other people fight. The economic model proved so successful that it spread across the empire. Amphitheatres appeared in Gaul, in Spain, in North Africa, in the eastern provinces. Some were massive stone structures that still stand today. Others were temporary wooden constructions that left no archaeological trace. But all served the same purposes: to provide entertainment, to demonstrate civic prestige, to generate economic activity, to bind local populations to Roman culture and values. This was cultural imperialism through market forces. Rome did not generally mandate that provinces build amphitheatres or stage games. But provincial elites, watching how the system worked in Italy, understood that adopting Roman entertainment forms brought them closer to power, made them more Roman in the eyes of those who controlled advancement and favour. The games spread not primarily through force, but through emulation, through the recognition that this was how successful people in the empire demonstrated their status and sophistication. And so the economic web grew denser, the number of stakeholders multiplied, the amount of wealth flowing through the system increased. By the 2nd century AD, the games had become economically entrenched to a degree that made them seem permanent, inevitable, as natural a part of the Mediterranean economy as grain trading or olive oil production. But economics alone does not explain the game's hold on Roman culture. Money created incentives, yes, but the games persisted because they met deeper needs, because they expressed values and beliefs that Romans held central to their identity. The economic system supported the cultural phenomenon, but it did not create it. The games existed because Romans wanted them to exist, because they found in the arena something that satisfied hungers money could not measure. Still, when we try to understand how the games lasted so long, survived so many changes in government and religion and social structure, we must acknowledge the economic foundation. Thousands of people made their living from organized combat. Millions more enjoyed the entertainment it provided. Entire industries depended on its continuation. Cities built their development plans around it. This was not a practice that could be abolished by mere moral argument or religious conversion. The economic roots went too deep for that. Those roots would have to be torn out by forces more powerful than ethics or belief. It would take the collapse of empire itself, the fracturing of trade networks, the disappearance of the wealth that made the games possible. Only when the economic foundation crumbled would the superstructure fall. But that collapse lay centuries ahead. For now, in the height of empire, the economics of blood generated prosperity for many, entertainment for millions, and death for those who had no choice but to fight. The system worked by its own measures, and working systems, however brutal, resist change with all the force that invested capital can muster. The Lannister counted their profits, the editors won their elections, the crowd enjoyed their shows, and the gladiators bled in sand that was regularly replaced because blood-soaked earth was bad for footing, and bad footing meant poor performance, and poor performance meant unhappy crowds, and unhappy crowds meant wasted investment. Even the blood had economics. In 72 AD, the Emperor Vespasian made a decision about a piece of land in the heart of Rome. This decision would create the most recognizable building in the ancient world, a structure so powerful in its symbolism and so sophisticated in its engineering that it would stand for 2,000 years as testament to what Rome was and what Rome believed. The land in question had been a lake, not a natural lake, but an artificial one, created by the previous emperor, Nero, as the centerpiece of his Domus Aurea, his golden house. Nero had seized vast portions of central Rome after the Great Fire of 64 AD, using the devastation as opportunity to build himself a private palace of stunning extravagance. The lake, surrounded by colonnades and gardens and pavilions, was his personal retreat in the middle of the city he ruled. Vespasian drained it. This was not a practical decision. It was a statement. Where Nero had taken public land for private pleasure, Vespasian would return it to public use. Where Nero had built a palace, Vespasian would build an amphitheatre. Where Nero had created a symbol of imperial selfishness, Vespasian would create a monument to imperial generosity. The political calculation was brilliant. Vespasian had come to power after a bloody civil war, the year of the 4 emperors in 69 AD. When Rome nearly tore itself apart, he needed legitimacy. He needed to demonstrate that his dynasty, the Flavian dynasty, named for his family name Flavius, represented a clean break from the chaos and corruption that had preceded it. The amphitheatre would be that demonstration, visible from across the city, unmissable in its message. The Flavians give to the people what the previous emperors took for themselves. The building they created later, called the Colosseum, likely after a colossal statue of Nero that stood nearby, was architecture as political propaganda. Every design choice carried meaning. Every stone proclaimed a message about power and order and Rome's place in the world. Consider its location, in the valley between the Palatine, Esquiline, and Caelian hills, visible from all directions, impossible to ignore. Anyone moving through central Rome would see it. Its presence dominated the urban landscape, a permanent reminder of Flavian generosity and the power that generosity represented. Consider its size: 189 meters long, 156 meters wide, 48 meters tall. It could seat 50,000 people, perhaps as many as 80,000 if people stood in the upper levels. This was a building designed to accommodate a significant fraction of Rome's population simultaneously. Everyone could attend. Everyone could witness. The games were not exclusive entertainment for the elite, they were mass spectacle that reinforced communal identity. Consider its facade: 4 stories, each decorated with engaged columns in a different classical order. The ground level featured Doric columns, the simplest, sturdiest, most martial of the Greek orders. The second level displayed Ionic columns, more refined, more decorative, suggesting culture and sophistication. The third level showed Corinthian columns, the most elaborate order, with capitals decorated with acanthus leaves, representing the pinnacle of architectural refinement. The fourth level was a solid wall with Corinthian pilasters and brackets for the velarium, the massive awning that could be extended to shade spectators. This vertical progression was not accidental. It represented the hierarchy of Roman society rendered in stone. Simple at the bottom, complex at the top, martial virtue giving way to refinement, giving way to luxury. The building's exterior was a diagram of how Romans understood their world: ordered, hierarchical, ascending from simple strength to sophisticated culture. The brackets on the fourth level tell their own story. The velarium was operated by sailors from the imperial fleet based at Misenum, brought to Rome specifically for this purpose. Imagine what the crowd saw: sailors scrambling across the top of the amphitheatre, manipulating ropes and pulleys to extend canvas across the opening, creating shade on hot days or shelter from sudden rain. This was a reminder that Roman power extended to the seas, that the emperor commanded not just the legions but the navy, that Rome's dominion reached across the Mediterranean and beyond. Even the awning was propaganda. Now move inside, and the political messaging becomes even more explicit. The seating arrangements encoded social hierarchy so precisely that you could determine someone's status simply by observing where they sat. The emperor occupied the pulvinar, the imperial box positioned to offer the perfect view of the arena. From here he could see everything, could make his judgments about who would live and who would die, could present himself as the ultimate arbiter of fate. The pulvinar was elevated above even the front rows, physically positioning the emperor above all others while simultaneously placing him in the center of the crowd's attention. He was watching them as much as they were watching the games. Senators sat in the podium, the lowest tier of seats closest to the action. They could see sweat on the gladiators, could hear their breathing and grunts and cries. They could smell blood. This proximity was both privilege and statement. Senators were Rome's elite, and they did not flinch from the reality of violence that maintained Roman power. To sit in the podium was to accept complicity in what the arena represented. Behind the senators sat the equestrians, the wealthy merchant class, the publicani who collected taxes, the businessmen who made Rome's economy function. The Maenianum Primum, this section was called, and it represented Rome's commercial class, literally supporting the military and political elite who sat below them. Ordinary Roman citizens filled the Maenianum Secundum, the larger middle section that comprised the bulk of the amphitheatre's seating. This was subdivided into sections based on profession or social affiliation. The system was complex, regulated by law, a matter of public concern. Where you sat announced who you were. Women, regardless of class, were relegated to the highest level along with slaves and the very poor. The Maenianum Summum in Ligne, the wooden seats at the top, represented the bottom of Roman social hierarchy. From up here the gladiators looked small, the details of combat difficult to discern. But you could still hear the crowd, could still participate in the communal experience, could still be part of the spectacle even if you watched from the worst seats. This was genius. The amphitheatre included everyone, but reminded everyone of their place. You entered through one of 76 numbered entrances, each leading to your section, your seats, your assigned position in Rome's social order. The emperor entered through his private entrance, senators through theirs, and so on down the hierarchy. The building physically separated people according to status, made inequality architectural, yet it also created unity. Everyone watched the same games. Everyone cheered for the same fighters or against them. Everyone participated in the decision of life or death when the crowd's voice influenced the editor's choice. The amphitheatre was simultaneously a map of division and a space of communal experience. It said, "We are different, we have different places, we are not equal, but we are all Romans, all part of this civilization, all united in what we value and enjoy." Beneath the arena floor, invisible to the spectators, lay the Hypogeum, literally underground. This was perhaps the Colosseum's most sophisticated innovation, a complex system of tunnels, cages, ramps, and elevators that allowed elaborate stage effects. 32 elevators, operated by pulleys and counterweights, could raise gladiators or animals from the depths to arena level. To the crowd, fighters appeared to materialize from nowhere, emerging from trapdoors in a moment of theatrical surprise. This was not simply spectacle, it was a demonstration of Roman engineering prowess, a statement that Rome commanded technology sophisticated enough to create what seemed like magic. The animal cages in the Hypogeum could house hundreds of beasts, lions and bears, leopards and bulls, exotic creatures from the far reaches of empire. On signal, attendants would guide or drive them up ramps toward the arena floor, timing their emergence for maximum dramatic effect. A hunter might be stalking what he thought was the last lion, when suddenly 3 more would appear from different trapdoors, surrounding him. The crowd would gasp. The hunter would have to adapt instantly. This was theatre, but theatre with lethal stakes. The Hypogeum also contained the machinery for flooding and draining the arena. Early in the Colosseum's history, before the Hypogeum was fully developed, the arena could be filled with water for mock naval battles naumachiae. Romans would watch fleets clash in miniature, prisoners condemned to die fighting in ships, while the crowd learned naval tactics and celebrated Rome's maritime dominance. Engineering, in service of education, in service of propaganda. Even the sand on the arena floor carried meaning. Arena, the word means sand in Latin. The sand absorbed blood, provided footing for fighters, could be raked smooth between bouts to erase evidence of the previous combat. but its color mattered. Red sand, iron-rich, made blood less visible. Yellow sand made it stand out. The choice of sand color affected what the crowd saw, how graphic the violence appeared. This was staging, lighting design for an era without electricity, using earth and minerals to control the visual experience. The whole structure was built with remarkable speed. Construction began around 72 AD under Vespasian. It was completed around 80 AD under his son Titus. 8 years to build something so massive, so complex, so enduring. This required enormous resources, stone quarried and transported from Tivoli, concrete poured by the thousands of tons, labor forces numbering in the tens of thousands. Much of that labor came from Jewish prisoners captured during the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD. They built the structure where they would later be forced to fight for Roman entertainment. Even the construction crew was chosen to send a message about conquest and subjugation. The opening games in 80 AD lasted 100 days. 100 consecutive days of combat, animal hunts, executions, spectacles. Ancient sources claim 9,000 animals died during these inaugural games. Whether that number is accurate or exaggerated, it represents scale beyond modern comprehension. 9,000 animals gathered from across the empire, transported to Rome, kept alive until their moment in the arena, then killed for entertainment. The logistics alone boggle the mind. The statement of power was unmistakable. Rome commands nature itself, can assemble life from 3 continents for the purpose of dramatic slaughter. Titus presided over these games personally. He gave gifts to the crowd, small wooden balls thrown into the stands that could be redeemed for food, money, luxury goods, even houses or slaves. This was redistribution of imperial wealth, making every spectator a recipient of the emperor's generosity. They would remember this. They would tell their children and grandchildren about the games where the emperor gave away fortunes, where the sky rained presents, where being Roman meant sharing in the spoils of empire. The Colosseum became a model copied across the empire. Amphitheatres in Capua, in Verona, in Nimes, in El Gem followed its design principles, adapted its innovations, echoed its message. Wherever Rome built an amphitheatre, it was saying, "This is civilization. This is what it means to be part of our world. This is how we entertain ourselves, how we demonstrate our values, how we organize society." But the Colosseum remained the original, the largest, the most significant. It was the heart of the gladiatorial world, the supreme arena where the finest fighters performed, where the most elaborate spectacles unfolded, where Roman identity was performed and reinforced day after day, year after year, century after century. Walking through its ruins today, you can still feel something of what it must have been. The scale overwhelms. The engineering impresses, but what strikes most forcefully is the clarity of its purpose. This was a machine for creating spectacle, for managing crowds, for expressing power. Every arch, every corridor, every level of seating was designed with intention. Nothing was accidental. It was architecture, in service of politics, in service of control. The Romans understood something profound about public space and public entertainment. They knew that buildings shape behavior, that design influences emotion, that architecture can encode values and reinforce hierarchies. The Colosseum was not just a venue for games. It was a teaching tool that instructed visitors in Roman values with every stone. It was a statement about imperial power more effective than any speech. It was propaganda that people lined up to experience willingly, even eagerly, without recognizing they were being taught. Vespasian died in 79 AD before the Colosseum was complete. His final words, reportedly delivered with characteristic dry humor, were, "Dear me, I think I'm becoming a god." The Romans deified their successful emperors after death. Vespasian was joking about his own impending apotheosis, maintaining wit even in his final moments. But in a sense, he had already achieved immortality. The Colosseum would stand as his monument, as the Flavian dynasty's monument, long after their names faded from common knowledge. People would visit it, would marvel at it, would try to imagine what it had been like to watch 50,000 people cheering as gladiators fought and died and sometimes triumphed. The building would outlast the games themselves. It would outlast the empire. It would survive earthquakes and fires and centuries of neglect and deliberate dismantling for building materials. And it would still be standing 2,000 years later, a shell of what it was, but still recognizable, still powerful, still capable of inspiring awe. This was what Rome built when Rome wanted to demonstrate its power, not just an amphitheater, a statement in stone that would echo across millennia, a declaration that said, "We were here, we did this, we commanded empires and engineering and human lives. Remember us, we remember. How could we forget?" The Colosseum made sure of that. The 2nd century after Christ marked the gladiatorial games at their zenith, not merely as entertainment, but as a refined instrument of imperial governance. By 100 AD, emperors had perfected the art of using spectacle to maintain power, to project strength, to bind diverse populations to Rome through shared experience of carefully orchestrated violence. Consider what Rome had become by this time, an empire stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine and Danube rivers to the Sahara Desert. 60 million people speaking dozens of languages, practicing countless local customs, worshipping innumerable gods. What held this together? Legions, certainly. Roads and trade networks, yes. A common legal system, administrative structures, the promise of citizenship and its benefits. But also, perhaps especially, a shared culture of spectacle that made being Roman mean something specific, something desirable, something worth preserving. The games were central to this cultural identity. They demonstrated Roman values, courage, discipline, acceptance of hierarchy, appreciation for skill, comfort with violence in service of order. They provided entertainment that crossed class boundaries while reinforcing them. They created celebrities and heroes whose fame spread across provinces, giving people in Spain and Syria and Britain common reference points, shared enthusiasms. When someone in Alexandria talked about a famous gladiator, someone in Londinium might know exactly who they meant. This was cultural unity created through blood sport. The emperors of the 2nd century understood this intuitively. They were, with occasional exceptions, remarkably capable rulers who had inherited a system perfected by their predecessors and knew how to use it. The era, from 96 to 180 AD, is sometimes called the time of the 5 good emperors: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. They presided over Rome's peak prosperity, stability, and territorial extent, and all of them, in different ways, used the games strategically. Trajan, ruling from 98 to 117 AD, understood spectacle perhaps better than any emperor before him. In 107 AD, celebrating his conquest of Dacia, modern Romania, he staged games that would be remembered for centuries: 123 consecutive days of combat. 123 days during which Romans could attend the Colosseum and watch men fight, animals die, criminals executed, naval battles staged. The numbers alone stagger comprehension. Ancient sources claim 10,000 gladiators fought during these games. 11,000 animals died. Whether these figures are exact or exaggerated, they represent scale beyond anything staged before. Trajan had just conquered Dacia, had seized the gold mines that made it wealthy, had captured perhaps 500,000 prisoners. Some of those prisoners were now fighting in the arena, The gold paid for the spectacles. The victory was being celebrated through the systematic destruction of what had been won. This was not cruelty for its own sake. This was strategic communication. Trajan was saying to the Roman people, "I conquered for you. The wealth of Dacia is yours. See how I share it through these magnificent games." He was saying to potential enemies, "This is what happens to those who resist Rome. Your warriors will die in our arena. Your people will entertain our crowds," he was saying to his soldiers. "Loyalty to Rome brings rewards beyond salary. Participate in our victories and share in their celebration." Every message carefully calibrated, every audience specifically targeted. The games worked exactly as intended. Trajan became one of Rome's most beloved emperors. When later emperors were wished well, the Senate would say, "May you be more fortunate than Augustus and better than Trajan." This was the gold standard of imperial success, and it was built partly on 123 days of killing. But Trajan also understood that games alone were not enough. He used the wealth from Dacia to fund massive public works: Trajan's Forum, Trajan's Column, Trajan's Market, aqueducts, roads, military fortifications. The games were part of a larger strategy of demonstrating that imperial conquest benefited everyone, that Rome's expansion meant prosperity shared. The bread came with the circuses, and both were essential. Hadrian, succeeding Trajan in 117 AD, deployed the games differently. He was an emperor who travelled constantly, the first to systematically visit all of Rome's provinces, spending more time away from Rome than in it, and wherever he went, he staged games. In Athens, he funded elaborate spectacles as part of his project to position himself as a Philhellene, a lover of Greek culture. In Alexandria, more games to demonstrate imperial favour. In provincial capitals across the empire, he used local amphitheatres to create moments where subject populations could experience imperial generosity directly. This was diplomatic theatre. Hadrian was showing provincials that they mattered, that the emperor cared about them specifically, that being part of the empire meant access to entertainment and excitement that would be impossible for small independent states to provide. The games became a tool of imperial integration, making distant provinces feel connected to Rome's centre. Hadrian also understood restraint. He did not stage spectacles as elaborate as Trajan's. He had adopted a more defensive military posture, building walls and fortifications rather than conquering new territories. There were no vast influxes of captives to fight, no looted gold to fund extravagance. So instead, he emphasized quality over quantity, staging smaller but well-executed games that demonstrated sophistication rather than overwhelming force. Antoninus Pius, ruling from 138 to 161 AD, took restraint further. He was famously frugal, preferring to spend money on infrastructure, military preparedness, and administrative efficiency rather than on spectacles. He staged games when required by tradition or expectation, but he did not use them as aggressively as his predecessors. His nickname Pius, meaning dutiful or pious, reflected his approach. He did what was necessary, what tradition demanded, but no more. Interestingly, this worked. His reign was peaceful, prosperous, stable. He proved that an emperor did not need constant, elaborate games to maintain power, at least not during times of peace and plenty. The games were one tool among many, to be used when needed, but not relied upon exclusively. This was mature governance, confident and measured. But his successor, Marcus Aurelius, would learn that what worked in peace might fail in crisis. Marcus, ruling from 161 to 180 AD, faced disasters his predecessors had been spared. The Parthian War in the east, the Antonine Plague, possibly smallpox that killed millions across the empire, the Marcomannic Wars, with Germanic tribes crossing the Danube and threatening Italy itself. Rome was under pressure unlike anything it had experienced in generations. Marcus needed money desperately. The treasury was depleted. He could not reduce military spending, the legions were fighting for survival. He could not raise taxes further, the plague had devastated the tax base. So he did something extraordinary. He held an estate sale in the Forum, selling imperial furniture, artwork, gold vessels, even his wife's jewelry and clothing. He liquidated the palace to fund the war effort, and then, with the money raised, he staged games. Because even in crisis, especially in crisis, Romans needed the reassurance that games provided. They needed to see that despite plague and invasion, despite death tolling in the thousands, Rome still functioned, still celebrated, still maintained its traditions. The games said, "We endure. We are still Rome. This crisis will pass." Marcus Aurelius was a Stoic philosopher, author of the Meditations, a man who wrote eloquently about virtue, duty, and the acceptance of fate. He found no pleasure in the arena, but he understood its necessity. He understood that governance sometimes requires doing things you find distasteful because the alternative is worse. He gave Rome its games because Rome needed them, because morale mattered as much as legions, because psychological warfare against despair was as important as military campaigns against barbarians. The games during his reign included innovations driven by financial constraint. Fewer exotic animals' trade routes were disrupted, costs were prohibitive. More emphasis on skilled gladiatorial combat, which required less in the way of expensive imported beasts. Creative reuse of gladiators who survived their bouts, reducing the need for constant replacement. The games adapted to circumstances while maintaining their essential function. Yet for all his philosophical wisdom, Marcus made one catastrophic error. He allowed his son Commodus to succeed him. This was a violation of the pattern established by the previous good emperors, who had adopted capable successors rather than relying on biological children. Marcus, whether from paternal affection or failure of judgment or simple lack of acceptable alternatives, designated Commodus his heir. Commodus would prove to be everything Marcus was not. Commodus ruled from 180 to 192 AD, and his reign represents the perversion of everything the games were meant to accomplish. He understood their power, but he misused it catastrophically. Where previous emperors had carefully maintained distance between themselves and the arena, presenting themselves as generous editors and ultimate judges but never as participants, Commodus decided to fight. He fought often. Ancient sources claim more than 700 appearances in the arena. 700 times the Emperor of Rome dressed as a gladiator and performed for the crowd. He styled himself as Hercules Romanus, demanded to be worshipped as a living god, and charged the treasury 1,000,000 sesterces for each of his appearances, paying himself with public funds for his own entertainment. This was madness, but calculated madness. Commodus genuinely seemed to believe that by fighting he was demonstrating imperial courage, that by winning he was proving his fitness to rule. He confused performance with power, spectacle with substance. He could not distinguish between the emperor who controls the games and the gladiator who participates in them, between the master and the slave. The fights themselves were rigged, of course. Commodus killed, drugged, or crippled animals. He fought gladiators armed with wooden weapons while he wielded real swords. He executed disabled persons and criminals in the arena and counted these as combats. One account describes him cutting off a man's nose, forcing him to fight, and then having him thrown to wild beasts. This was not courage, it was cruelty performed as entertainment. Romans could tolerate cruelty. They had tolerated emperors far more vicious than Commodus. What they could not tolerate was the degradation of the imperial office itself. By appearing as a gladiator, Commodus made himself infamous, marked by the same legal stain that attached to all arena performers. He was, technically, no longer fully fit to hold office under Roman law. An emperor could do nearly anything, but he could not make himself a slave, and that is effectively what Commodus did by fighting for entertainment. The Senate despised him. The military grew restless. Even the Praetorian Guard, the elite troops who served as imperial bodyguards, began plotting against him. Commodus was finally assassinated in 192 AD, strangled in his bath by a wrestler after other assassination attempts had failed. His death triggered civil war, the year of the 5 emperors, in 193 AD, when multiple claimants fought for the throne. The games had helped destroy an emperor. Commodus had treated them as personal entertainment rather than political tool, had elevated his own participation above strategic necessity, had confused the symbol with reality, and Rome had paid the price in blood and chaos. Yet throughout all of this, through wise emperors and foolish ones, through peace and plague and war, the games continued. They had achieved a kind of inevitability. Emperors came and went, dynasties rose and fell, crises erupted and were resolved. But the games remained constant. They were the bedrock of Roman entertainment culture, seemingly as permanent as the Colosseum itself. There were innovations during this period that reveal sophistication and evolution. Gladiators became increasingly specialized, with more types and subtypes emerging: the scissor, with his blade mounted on his forearm; the provocator, who fought only other provocatores; the Sagittarius, who used bow and arrows. Training became more rigorous, more scientific. The physician Galen, working with gladiators in Pergamon before moving to Rome, developed surgical techniques and anatomical knowledge that would influence medicine for 1500 years. His work on nerves, tendons, and trauma care emerged directly from treating gladiatorial wounds. The arena became a laboratory where medical science advanced through observation of injury and experimentation with treatment. Betting on fights became increasingly sophisticated. People did not simply wager on outcomes, but on specific events: whether a fighter would be wounded in the first exchange, whether the editor would grant mercy, how long a combat would last. This created a complex gambling culture with its own vocabulary and etiquette. The games generated excitement that extended beyond the arena into taverns and homes, into conversations and arguments, and lifelong loyalties to particular fighters or styles. Famous gladiators became cultural figures whose influence extended far beyond combat. Graffiti in Pompeii declares one fighter the glory of girls and the groan of women. Another inscription reads, "Celadus the Thrax makes the girls swoon." These men were sex symbols, celebrities, brands unto themselves. Their images appeared on oil lamps, pottery, mosaics. Children played games pretending to be them. They were the athletes and movie stars of their era, known across the empire, their victories and defeats discussed by people who would never attend a game in person, but who heard about them second-hand and formed passionate opinions nonetheless. This was the games at peak functionality, politically useful, economically productive, culturally central, socially unifying. They had reached a kind of perfection as an institution, refined through generations of trial and error into something that served multiple purposes simultaneously. They entertained, they redistributed wealth, they reinforced hierarchy. They demonstrated imperial power, they created shared culture, they employed thousands. They inspired devotion and loyalty and excitement. But perfection is fragile. Systems at their peak have nowhere to go but down. The 2nd century represented a high point that could not be maintained indefinitely. The resources required, the political will necessary, the cultural consensus supporting the games, all of these would face challenges in the coming centuries. challenges from within, as Christianity spread and questioned the moral foundations of spectacle based on suffering. Challenges from without, as barbarian invasions and economic collapse undermined the infrastructure and wealth that made such elaborate entertainment possible. For now, though, in the reign of the good emperors, in the great amphitheatres of Rome and the provinces, under the shade of the velarium and the roar of 50,000 voices, the games seemed eternal. They seemed as much a part of civilization as language or law. They seemed destined to last as long as Rome itself. That destiny would be tested. The games would face existential challenges that their creators could never have imagined. But before we reach that crisis, before we witness the slow collapse of the system that seemed so permanent, let us appreciate what had been built. A machinery of spectacle so effective, so refined, so deeply woven into the fabric of society that it seemed impossible to imagine Rome without it. The 2nd century showed the games working exactly as designed. It would take centuries more to prove that design was not, after all, eternal. In the catacombs beneath Rome, in secret meeting places across the empire, a different story was being told. Not of courage in the arena, not of glory through combat, not of entertainment through death. A story about a man executed by crucifixion who taught that the meek would inherit the earth, that the last would be first, that all souls were equal before God regardless of status or wealth or power. This was not simply a competing religion. This was a challenge to the fundamental assumptions upon which Roman civilization rested. Consider what the games expressed. They said that hierarchy is natural and good, that some people, emperors, editors, even crowds, have the power of life and death over others, that criminals and slaves and conquered enemies deserve their fate. That violence in service of order is not just acceptable but admirable. That mercy, while sometimes granted, is a gift from the powerful rather than a right of the powerless. That entertainment through suffering demonstrates Roman superiority and strength. Christianity said the opposite of nearly all of this. It preached that all souls are equal, that mercy is not optional but commanded. That violence, even state-sanctioned violence, is wrong, that the suffering of the condemned matters to God, that how you treat the lowest person in society reveals your true character. That forgiveness trumps vengeance, that compassion matters more than strength, that worldly power and hierarchy mean nothing in the kingdom of heaven. These ideas were incompatible with the games at a fundamental level. You could not truly believe both. You had to choose. The first Christians understood this immediately. They refused to attend the games. This was not passive disapproval, it was active resistance. In a society where attendance at public spectacles was expected, where participation in communal entertainment demonstrated civic virtue and Roman identity, refusing to attend was a statement. It marked you as different, as potentially disloyal, as someone who rejected core Roman values. The Romans noticed. They understood that Christianity was not simply another mystery cult or foreign religion that could be incorporated into Rome's remarkably tolerant religious landscape. This was something else. This was ideological opposition to the structures that maintained Roman power, and so they used the games themselves as a weapon against this new religion. If Christians objected to the arena, then the arena would consume them. This was strategy, not just persecution. It was an attempt to use the very institution Christians opposed to demonstrate the futility of that opposition, to show that Roman power was absolute and resistance was pointless. In 64 AD, when fire devastated Rome and the Emperor Nero needed a scapegoat, he blamed Christians. He had them arrested in large numbers and executed in spectacular fashion. Some were covered in animal skins and torn apart by dogs in the arena. Others were crucified. Still others were burned alive at night to serve as torches illuminating Nero's gardens. The earliest Christian martyrs died as entertainment, as spectacle, as demonstration of what happened to those who rejected Roman values. Nero's strategy failed spectacularly. Instead of intimidating Christians into submission, the martyrdoms became recruiting tools. The courage of those who went to their death singing hymns, refusing to renounce their faith even facing lions or fire, inspired observers. Every martyr made new converts. The blood of Christians, as the church father Tertullian would later write, became the seed of the church. This was a phenomenon the Romans had not anticipated. Gladiators who showed courage were admired, yes, but they were still slaves, still infamous, still fundamentally dishonorable despite their bravery. But Christians dying in the arena were doing something different. They were not fighting for survival or freedom or glory. They were choosing death over apostasy, were demonstrating a form of courage that looked similar to gladiatorial virtus, but was directed toward completely different ends. They were creating competing heroes in the cultural imagination, alternative models of bravery that challenged everything the gladiatorial system represented. The persecutions continued sporadically over the next 2 centuries. Under Domitian in the 90s AD, under Trajan, despite his reputation as a good emperor, he ordered that Christians who refused to sacrifice to the Roman gods should be executed, though he also ruled that they should not be actively hunted. Under Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, who allowed terrible persecutions in Gaul and Asia Minor, under Decius in the 250s AD, who ordered empire-wide persecution requiring all citizens to sacrifice to the gods or face death. Under Diocletian beginning in 303 AD, the most severe persecution yet, an attempt to eradicate Christianity entirely. Christians died in arenas across the empire. In Rome, in Lyon, in Carthage, in Smyrna, in Alexandria. Their stories were recorded, remembered, venerated. Saints emerged from the arena: Saint Perpetua and Saint Felicity in Carthage, Saint Ignatius of Antioch, Saint Polycarp, dozens more whose names were preserved in martyrologies and whose deaths became sacred narratives rivaling any gladiatorial saga. But something else was happening simultaneously. Christianity was growing, despite persecution, perhaps because of persecution. It spread through all levels of Roman society. Poor and rich, slave and free, soldier and merchant, men and women, Christianity crossed boundaries that Roman religion rarely traversed. By the 3rd century, Christian communities existed throughout the empire, practicing their faith in varying degrees of secrecy, developing sophisticated theology and organization, becoming a significant minority that could not easily be eliminated. The Romans faced a dilemma. The games required public consensus on their legitimacy. They worked because everyone agreed, or seemed to agree, that this was proper entertainment, that the violence was justified, that the spectacle served good purposes. But a significant and growing portion of the population now questioned that consensus. They didn't just object quietly, they maintained communities built on opposition to core Roman values, including the values the games expressed. Emperors could ignore this, they could suppress it through violence, or they could adapt. Different emperors chose different paths. Constantine I, coming to power in 306 AD after yet another civil war, made the calculation that adaptation offered more advantages than suppression. He had supposedly won the crucial Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 AD after having a vision of the Christian symbol with the words, "In this sign you shall conquer." Whether the vision was real or invented, the political logic was clear. Christianity had become too widespread, too organized, too deeply rooted to eliminate through persecution. Better to co-opt it, to harness its organizational power and moral authority in service of the empire. In 313 AD, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, legalizing Christianity throughout the empire. This was revolutionary. For the first time in Roman history, Christians could practice their faith openly, could build churches, could participate fully in civic life without fear. Constantine himself converted, whether sincerely or strategically, remains debated, and began favoring Christians in appointments and policy. But Constantine was not naive. He knew that abandoning the games entirely would alienate the pagan majority who still loved them, who still viewed them as fundamentally Roman, who would see their elimination as cultural surrender. So he compromised. He issued restrictions on gladiatorial combat, particularly on the use of condemned criminals who might be Christians, while stopping short of outright abolition. He reduced imperial funding for games while not banning them completely. He sent mixed signals officially disapproving while not actively enforcing prohibition. This was strategic ambiguity. It satisfied neither pagans nor Christians entirely, but it maintained his support from both. It allowed the games to continue in modified form while signaling that the empire's direction had changed. It bought time for Christianity to grow strong enough that the games could eventually be abandoned without triggering massive resistance. Constantine's sons pushed further. Constantius II, ruling the Eastern Empire from 337 to 361 AD, issued a decree in 357 AD, formally abolishing gladiatorial combat. This was the first explicit imperial ban. It said, clearly and officially, that the games were no longer acceptable, that Christian morality now shaped imperial policy. But decree and enforcement are different things. Constantius lacked the administrative apparatus to stop games throughout the empire. Provincial governors still staged them, local elites still funded them, audiences still attended enthusiastically. The decree was more statement than reality, it announced, where the empire was heading without forcing immediate confrontation with entrenched traditions and economic interests. This was sophisticated governance. By issuing the decree, Constantius established the legal and moral framework for the game's eventual end. He made opposition official, but by not enforcing it rigorously, he avoided triggering rebellions in provinces where games remained popular, where they were woven into local culture and economy, where their sudden elimination would have caused genuine hardship and resentment. The decree allowed regional variation. In the Christian-heavy eastern provinces, games diminished rapidly. In pagan-dominated regions of the west and north, they continued with little change. This flexibility let the empire manage a massive cultural transformation without tearing itself apart through imposed uniformity. But the games were resilient. They had existed for 6 centuries. They employed thousands. They entertained millions. They expressed values and beliefs that did not vanish simply because an emperor issued a decree or a new religion preached different principles. Cultural change happened slowly, through generations, through gradual shifting of assumptions and attitudes rather than sudden rupture. The conflict between Christian morality and gladiatorial entertainment played out in thousands of local contexts. Christian bishops condemned the games from their pulpits, calling them murder disguised as entertainment. Pagan intellectuals defended them as expressions of courage and traditional Roman virtue. Christian emperors issued restrictions. Pagan or sympathetic governors ignored those restrictions. Christian citizens stayed away from amphitheaters. Pagan citizens attended as enthusiastically as ever, sometimes specifically to demonstrate their rejection of Christian values. And some people existed in the middle, uncomfortable but uncertain. They were Christian or sympathetic to Christianity, but they had grown up with the games, had enjoyed them, had memories of attending with family, had favorite fighters they had cheered for. The games were woven into their identity as Romans. Giving them up meant giving up part of what being Roman meant. This was a wrenching choice, and many simply avoided making it clearly, attending occasionally while feeling vaguely guilty, or staying away while feeling vaguely nostalgic. The tension was real and profound. It represented a civilization trying to transform its values without destroying its cohesion. Rome was attempting to become Christian while remaining Roman, to abandon practices that had defined it while maintaining the identity those practices had created. The games represented perhaps the clearest point of conflict. You could be Christian and participate in most Roman civic life. You could hold office, serve in the military, engage in commerce, pay taxes, follow laws, all while maintaining your faith. But the games forced a choice. Either you accepted that entertainment through suffering was morally acceptable, or you rejected it. There was no comfortable middle ground. Christian theologians devoted considerable effort to explaining why the games were wrong. They were not content to simply say, "Our religion forbids this." They developed sophisticated moral arguments. The games corrupted spectators by making them enjoy suffering. They debased humanity by treating people as entertainment. They violated the sanctity of life that God had created. They encouraged bloodlust and cruelty. They distracted from spiritual concerns with worldly spectacle. They demonstrated that Roman civilization, despite its achievements, remained fundamentally pagan and unchristian in its values. These arguments gradually gained traction. Not through winning debates, the Romans were not transformed by Christian philosophy defeating pagan philosophy in intellectual combat, but through slow accumulation of converts, through Christian communities growing and Christian values spreading, through the simple fact that more and more Romans came to believe that the games were wrong. By the late 4th century, this shift was becoming visible. Attendance at games in some cities was declining. Amphitheaters in Christian-dominated regions were being abandoned or converted to other uses. The cultural consensus that had sustained the games for centuries was eroding, not collapsing but weakening, developing cracks that would eventually bring down the entire structure. Yet in Rome itself, the games continued. The Colosseum still hosted combats. Gladiators still trained and fought, and sometimes died. The crowds still came, still cheered, still participated in rituals that had been performed for half a millennium. The games were dying, but they were dying slowly, resisting their end with the tenacity of institutions that have become so embedded they seem natural and inevitable. It would take a specific event, a crystallizing moment, to provide the catalyst for the final transformation. That moment came in 404 AD, when a monk from the Eastern Empire named Telemachus made a decision that would cost him his life but would change history. We will come to his story, but first, understand the context. By the early 5th century, Christianity had been the empire's official religion for decades. Emperors were Christian. The church was wealthy and powerful. Bishops wielded enormous influence. Yet still the games continued, still they attracted crowds, still they persisted despite centuries of Christian opposition. This was not hypocrisy. Exactly. It was complexity. It was the gap between official policy and lived reality. It was the difficulty of changing institutions and habits and pleasures that had existed longer than living memory. It was the inertia of culture, the resistance that tradition offers to transformation. Christianity had won, officially, but the games had not yet lost. The conflict remained unresolved, the tension unrelieved. Something would have to give. Either Christianity would accommodate itself to the games, would find a way to accept or reinterpret them, or the games would finally end. Telemachus, in his moment of desperate courage, would force that resolution. His death would accomplish what centuries of theological argument and imperial decree had not quite achieved. He would become the last martyr, dying not in persecution but in protest, killed not by the state but by a crowd that could not yet accept what Christianity demanded of them. The games had created martyrs for 3 centuries. They were about to create one final martyr who would, in dying, finally kill them in return. On the first day of January in the year 404 AD, a monk named Telemachus arrived in Rome. He had travelled from the eastern provinces, possibly from Asia Minor or Syria, drawn by reports that gladiatorial combat still continued in the capital, despite decades of Christian emperors and official prohibitions. He came to witness this for himself, and perhaps to do something about it. The city he entered was not the Rome of Trajan or Marcus Aurelius. The population had declined from perhaps 1 million to maybe half that. Aqueducts still functioned, but maintenance was sporadic. The great public buildings remained, but some showed signs of neglect. The Western Roman Empire was struggling, pressed by barbarian invasions along the Rhine and Danube, economically weakened, administratively strained. But some traditions persisted, and the games were among them. Telemachus made his way to the Colosseum on a day when games were scheduled. He found his place among the crowd. Sources suggest 50,000 people still attended, though this may be exaggeration by later Christian chroniclers wanting to emphasize his courage. The combats began. Gladiators entered the arena. Steel met steel. Blood darkened the sand, and Telemachus could not bear it. He leaped from his seat, descended to the arena floor, and positioned himself between the fighters. He called out to the crowd, pleading with them to stop, shouting that Christians should not watch killing, that this entertainment was murder, that Rome must abandon this barbarism. The exact words are lost to history, but the intent was clear. He was offering himself as obstacle, using his body to prevent the combat from continuing. The crowd's reaction was fury. They had come for entertainment. They had paid or received free admission to watch skilled fighters display courage and violence. This monk was interrupting their pleasure, presuming to judge them, interfering with Roman tradition. They began throwing objects, food, perhaps stones. The gladiators themselves, confused by this interruption, may have struck at him. The details vary in different accounts, but the outcome is consistent. Telemachus died in the arena, killed by the crowd he had tried to convert, murdered for his protest against murder. The Emperor Honorius, ruling the Western Empire from his capital in Ravenna, heard about the incident. He had already been inclined toward ending the games. They were expensive. They offended Christian sensibilities. They served diminishing political purpose as the empire contracted. But Telemachus's death provided the catalyst. Shortly after, Honorius issued a decree formally abolishing gladiatorial combat throughout the empire. This time, the decree held. Not because enforcement was suddenly more effective. Honorius had limited control over distant provinces, but because the moment had arrived when prohibition aligned with reality. The games were already dying. Telemachus's martyrdom simply provided the official occasion to acknowledge what was already happening. Consider the forces converging to make the games unsustainable. Christianity offered moral opposition, yes, but moral opposition alone had not been sufficient for a century. What killed the games was the collapse of the systems that made them possible. The Western Empire's tax base was shrinking catastrophically. Provinces fell to barbarian control. Britain abandoned in 410. Much of Gaul and Spain lost to various Germanic tribes. North Africa falling to the Vandals by 439. Each lost province meant lost revenue, fewer resources available for any purpose, including entertainment. The treasury was perpetually empty, needed for desperate military spending, for bribing barbarian leaders to remain peaceful, for maintaining what remained of imperial administration. There was simply no money for games, and without imperial funding, without subsidies from the state treasury, the economics that had made gladiatorial schools viable collapsed. Lannister could not maintain facilities, could not purchase and train new fighters, could not survive on local sponsorship alone. The business model required scale, required the ability to rent fighters across regions, required reliable customers who could pay substantial fees. That market was evaporating. The supply chains that brought exotic animals from Africa and Asia had broken down completely. Consider what was required to bring a lion from Africa to Rome. You needed traders operating in territory where lions lived. You needed those traders to be willing and able to capture lions alive, a dangerous, difficult, expensive process. You needed transport to the coast, which required roads and way stations and security from bandits. You needed ships capable of carrying dangerous cargo, sailors willing to work them, ports where they could unload. You needed overland transport from port to amphitheater. You needed handlers, veterinarians, feeding systems. By 400 AD, much of this infrastructure no longer existed. The Vandals controlled North Africa, disrupting Mediterranean shipping. Barbarian raids made overland transport unreliable and expensive. The Roman state no longer controlled enough territory to maintain the military security that safe trade required. Getting a lion from Africa to Rome, which had been routine in the 2nd century, was now so difficult and expensive that it might require diplomatic negotiations with multiple barbarian kingdoms, massive bribes, and acceptance of huge risk that the animal would die en route. The same applied to prisoners of war, the traditional source of gladiators. Rome was no longer conquering territories and bringing back thousands of captives. Instead, Rome was desperately defending its shrinking borders against invasions. The empire had no surplus prisoners to feed into the arena. Instead, it needed every able-bodied man for the legions, needed them as soldiers rather than as entertainment. The administrative capacity to maintain amphitheaters had dissolved. These were complex structures requiring constant upkeep. Stone needed repointing, wood needed replacement. The hypogeum's elevators and trapdoors required skilled engineers to maintain. Seating needed repair. The Valerium needed sailors to operate it, but the imperial fleet was needed for defense, not for amphitheater awnings. Cities could not afford maintenance. The craftsmen who knew how to do the work were dying without training apprentices. The institutional knowledge of how to run an amphitheater was being lost as the generation that had operated them died and was not replaced. By the mid-5th century, many amphitheaters were already in disrepair, their mechanisms broken, their seating unsafe, their infrastructure crumbling. Most critically, the strategic purpose of the games had vanished. Emperors no longer ruled vast territories where they needed to maintain urban loyalty through bread and circuses. The Western Empire by 430 AD was barely more than Italy, a remnant state clinging to existence. Emperors could not stage games in provinces they did not control, and they could not afford them in provinces they did. The games had worked when Rome was confident, wealthy, expanding, secure. They made sense as expressions of imperial power when that power was real and growing. But as the empire contracted, as resources dwindled, as survival itself became uncertain, the games became luxuries Rome could no longer afford financially, yes, but also psychologically. It is hard to celebrate through spectacles of dominance when your civilization is being dominated, hard to stage triumphs when you are losing, hard to entertain through violence when violence is threatening your existence. Honorius's decree in 404 was not so much a cause as a recognition. He was acknowledging reality and claiming credit for it, allowing Christianity to appear to have won through moral authority what had actually been decided by economic and military collapse. The decree said, "We are ending the games because they are unchristian." The truth was, the games are ending because we cannot sustain them, and Christianity provides a convenient explanation that sounds better than admitting defeat. Provincial games continued sporadically into the 430s. In Gaul, in Spain, in some Italian cities, local wealthy landowners still had resources sufficient to stage small combats. These were nothing like the imperial spectacles of previous centuries, a few fighters, local criminals or slaves rather than trained gladiators, modest crowds. But they represented continuity, the persistence of tradition even as the world that created that tradition disappeared. The very last recorded gladiatorial combat took place sometime in the 430s or early 440s. The exact date is lost. After that, silence. No more inscriptions recording games. No more graffiti celebrating fighters. No more literary references to attending combats. The games simply stopped, not with dramatic finale but with quiet cessation. The last fighters fought and died or survived, and then there were no more. The Colosseum remained standing, but its purpose had ended. For a few decades it hosted animal hunts without gladiatorial combat, venaciones, that continued because they required less infrastructure, less expense, less organized supply chains. But even these faded. By the late 5th century, the Colosseum was largely unused, its hypogeum silent, its seats empty. Nature began reclaiming it. Seeds carried in the fur of long-dead exotic animals, seeds from distant continents brought to Rome and dropped in the arena or the holding areas beneath, began to sprout. Within decades, plants were growing in the Colosseum's cracks and crevices. Within centuries, it had become a garden, with archaeologists eventually identifying 250 species of plants growing in its ruins, species from Africa, Asia, and Europe, growing together where men had once killed each other for entertainment. There is something almost redemptive in this image. The building created for death became a sanctuary for life, the place where blood-soaked sand hosted ecosystems of remarkable diversity. Destruction transformed into beauty, violence into verdancy. The Colosseum became more interesting, in some ways, as a ruin colonized by plants than it had been as a functioning amphitheater. But we should not romanticize this too much. The games ended not because Romans collectively decided they were wrong, not because moral progress triumphed over barbarism. They ended because the civilization that created them collapsed. The infrastructure failed, the wealth disappeared, the administrative capacity evaporated, the strategic purpose became obsolete. If Rome had remained strong, if the empire had not fallen, would the games have continued despite Christian opposition? Quite possibly, Christianity might have accommodated itself to them eventually, found theological justifications, accepted them as regrettable necessities of maintaining imperial unity. Or perhaps Christian opposition would have prevailed regardless, we cannot know. History took the path it took, and speculation about alternatives is interesting but ultimately unanswerable. What we can say with confidence is that the game's end was overdetermined. Multiple causes converged: Christian morality, economic collapse, military defeat, administrative failure, loss of strategic purpose, infrastructure breakdown. Remove any one cause, and the others might still have been sufficient. The games died because everything that sustained them died simultaneously. The archaeological record from this period tells a story of gradual abandonment. Amphitheaters in some cities were deliberately dismantled, their stone repurposed for defensive walls, as cities contracted and fortified themselves against barbarian raids. The Colosseum itself was partly stripped. The bronze clamps that held stones together were pried out and melted down, leaving the distinctive holes visible today. Stone was taken for other building projects. The structure that had taken 8 years to build was slowly cannibalized over centuries. Other amphitheaters were simply left to decay. Weather and vegetation did their work. Wooden seating rotted. Stone cracked in winter freezes. Buildings collapsed in earthquakes and were not repaired. By the medieval period, Many amphitheatres were so overgrown and ruined that local populations did not know what they had been, invented legends about them being work of giants or demons, lost the memory of their actual purpose. The Colosseum was large enough and well built enough to persist. It became a quarry, a fortress, a religious site with churches built into its structure, at various times a housing complex, with people living in its arches. It was never quite forgotten, too massive to ignore, but its original purpose faded from living memory. Medieval Romans looking at it knew it had been important, knew it was ancient, but many did not know exactly what had happened there. The knowledge was eventually recovered through scholarly research, through reading ancient texts, through archaeological investigation. The Renaissance sparked renewed interest in classical antiquity, and the Colosseum became a symbol of Rome's past greatness and fall. Romantics in later centuries saw it as a lesson about the impermanence of empires, the inevitable decay of human achievements. Byron wrote of it, "While stands the Colosseum, Rome shall stand. When falls the Colosseum, Rome shall fall. And when Rome falls, the world." But in the 5th century, as the games ended, no one was thinking about symbolic meaning or future archaeological interest. They were struggling with immediate crises: famine, plague, invasion, economic collapse, the dissolution of the only civilization they had known. The end of the games was a minor detail in a catastrophe of overwhelming scope. Some must have felt sadness. There were Romans in 430 AD who had attended games as children, who remembered the excitement and spectacle, who associated the games with better times. Watching this tradition end represented another piece of their world disappearing, another connection to the past severed. They were witnessing not just the end of entertainment, but the end of civilization as they understood it. Others must have felt relief. Christians who had always found the games morally repugnant could see their end as evidence of moral progress, as Christianity finally transforming society in accordance with its values. They could interpret the fall of Rome as divine punishment for past sins, and the end of the games as one step toward redemption. And still others probably did not notice particularly. When your city is being besieged, when food is scarce, when barbarian armies are approaching, whether gladiators are fighting in the local amphitheatre seems fairly insignificant. The games ended during a period when many Romans had far more pressing concerns than entertainment. 7 centuries after the first recorded Munus in 264 BC, the games were finished. The institution that had seemed eternal, that had survived regime changes and religious transformations and military defeats, that had persisted through good emperors and bad, through peace and war, through expansion and contraction, that institution finally died, not with glory, but with a whimper, not through dramatic abolition, but through quiet cessation, not because humanity had evolved beyond needing such entertainment, but because the civilization that provided it could no longer afford to. The last gladiator to fight in the Colosseum is unknown. We do not know his name, his fighting style, whether he won or lost, whether he survived or died. He vanished into history without notice, without memorial, without anyone recognizing that he was the last of his kind. The games ended not with climax, but with silence, with an absence where there had once been cheering crowds and clashing swords and blood on sand. And then the seeds began to sprout, and the garden began to grow, and life transformed what death had created. The gladiators did not die when the games ended. They transformed. They became symbols, myths, mirrors, in which each subsequent age could see its own preoccupations reflected back. The actual men who fought and died in Roman arenas, their lived experiences, their fears and hopes and pain disappeared beneath layers of interpretation and reinterpretation, each era using them for its own purposes, making them mean whatever that era needed them to mean. Consider how quickly the truth became malleable. Within a century of the game's end, medieval Christians needed a simplified story about pagan Rome to contrast with Christian virtue. The gladiators became exemplars of barbarism, proof that pre-Christian civilization was fundamentally corrupt and savage. The games were portrayed as pure bloodlust, with Romans portrayed as inhuman monsters who cheered at suffering for no reason beyond depravity. This was not quite accurate, as we have seen. The games served complex purposes: political control, economic exchange, cultural identity, demonstrations of courage within a hierarchical system. They were terrible, yes, but they were terrible in comprehensible ways, for reasons that made sense within Roman logic. They were not simply insanity or evil incarnate, but medieval Christianity needed that simplified narrative. It needed Rome to be clearly, obviously wrong, so that Christianity's triumph could appear clearly, obviously right. Nuance did not serve this purpose, so the gladiators became symbols of everything Christianity had saved humanity from: violence, cruelty, slavery, the devaluation of human life. The Renaissance brought rediscovery of classical texts and a different interpretation. Humanist scholars reading ancient sources found descriptions of gladiatorial courage, of skill and training and honor within the arena. They began celebrating gladiators as exemplars of martial virtue, using them to critique what they saw as contemporary weakness and decadence. These scholars were not defending the game's cruelty. Rather, they were extracting what they valued: the discipline, the bravery, the willingness to face death with dignity, and separating it from what they found distasteful. They created an idealized gladiator who represented Renaissance values of individual excellence and classical virtue. A figure who may never have actually existed, but who served their philosophical and political purposes. Military reformers in various European states used gladiatorial imagery to promote martial training and warrior culture. If ancient Rome had conquered the world through producing men of such courage and skill, perhaps modern states could emulate this by reviving emphasis on physical training, combat proficiency, and willingness to accept sacrifice. The gladiator became a model for the ideal soldier. The Enlightenment brought yet another transformation. Philosophers like Rousseau used gladiatorial combat as evidence for their arguments about civilization's corrupting influence. They claimed that societies finding entertainment in death had lost their moral compass, that the games proved Rome was sick at its core despite its technological and administrative achievements. This was philosophy using history as ammunition. Rousseau was not primarily interested in understanding Romans on their own terms. He was making arguments about natural virtue versus social corruption, about how civilization might pervert human nature. The gladiators served this argument perfectly. Here was clear evidence that a highly civilized society could be morally bankrupt, that technological progress did not equal ethical progress. The 19th century brought romanticism and revolution, and gladiators transformed again. The Spartacus revolt of 73 to 71 BC, briefly mentioned earlier, but crucial to later interpretation, became a symbol of revolutionary struggle. Spartacus, the Thracian gladiator who escaped with 70 companions using kitchen knives, whose rebellion swelled to 70,000 followers, who defeated Roman legions 4 times, before finally being crushed, he became a hero of liberation. The actual Spartacus remains obscure. We know remarkably little about him beyond the basic facts of his revolt. Was he fighting for freedom, for revenge, simply for survival? Was he ideologically opposed to slavery, or just trying to escape it personally? Did he envision creating a new society, or just wanted to go home? The sources do not tell us clearly. But 19th century revolutionaries did not need accurate history. They needed inspirational mythology. Spartacus became a working-class hero, a slave who dared challenge the masters, a fighter who nearly brought Rome to its knees. When his rebellion was finally defeated and 6,000 captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way, from Rome to Capua, a forest of crosses stretching 50 miles, a display of Roman power and vengeance so extreme it still horrifies across 2 millennia that became martyrdom. Evidence of Rome's fear of what Spartacus represented. Karl Marx praised Spartacus as one of history's finest characters. Soviet revolutionaries named their movement after him. He appeared in novels, plays, and eventually films as the embodiment of resistance to oppression. The historical Spartacus disappeared entirely beneath the symbolic one. 20th century fascism appropriated Roman imagery heavily but interestingly downplayed gladiatorial aspects. Mussolini and the Italian fascists loved Roman symbolism, the fasces, the eagle standards, the imperial architecture, the legions, but they focused on military conquest and administrative efficiency rather than arena combat. Perhaps they recognized that gladiators, slaves fighting for others' entertainment, did not fit the fascist narrative of national strength and dominance. Hitler and the Nazis made different use of Rome, emphasizing its racial theories and imperial expansion while largely ignoring the games. They preferred their own spectacles rallies at Nuremberg, the Berlin Olympics, to historical references to arena combat. Hollywood discovered gladiators in the 1950s and 60s, creating the genre of sword and sandal epics. Films like Spartacus, Quo Vadis, and The Fall of the Roman Empire portrayed gladiators as heroes fighting tyranny, usually incorporating Christian themes of redemption and moral awakening. These films were more about Cold War concerns, individual freedom versus totalitarian control, than about ancient Rome. The actual gladiatorial experience, training, fighting, living in the ludus, existing in the strange social space of the infamous. Who could become famous interested these filmmakers far less than using arena settings for adventure and moral parables. The films were entertaining, often spectacular, but they created a vision of gladiatorial life that bore minimal resemblance to historical reality. Modern scholarship has tried to recover the actual gladiators from beneath these layers of interpretation. Archaeologists excavating gladiator cemeteries have found skeletons with healed wounds, showing these men received excellent medical care, that they often survived multiple combats, that they were valuable property maintained carefully. Inscriptions preserve names and records. Flamma, who won 21 times, was granted freedom 4 times and chose to return to fighting 4 times. Why? We do not know, but his choices complicate simple narratives about gladiators desperate for freedom. Other inscriptions show gladiators had fans, groupies, people who admired them intensely. Some gladiators married, had children, lived lives more complex than simply fighting and dying. They existed in a system we find abhorrent, but they were still humans finding ways to live, to hope, to create meaning within constraints they could not control. Modern combat sports trace lineage to gladiators, though the connection is more mythological than actual. Boxing, wrestling, mixed martial arts, these sports emphasize one-on-one combat, test of skill and courage. Audiences watching and judging. Promoters deliberately invoke gladiatorial imagery, calling fighters modern gladiators. Staging events in venues meant to evoke amphitheaters. But the differences are profound. Modern fighters choose to compete. They fight under rules designed to prevent death or permanent injury. They can quit. They receive payment and fame on their own behalf rather than enriching owners. The superficial similarities mask fundamental distinctions about agency, choice, and human dignity. Still, something persists. The appeal of watching skilled combat, of seeing courage tested, of experiencing controlled danger vicariously, these psychological elements that made the games appealing to Romans still influence modern entertainment. We like to think we are different, that we have evolved beyond finding violence entertaining, but Ultimate Fighting Championship events draw millions of viewers. Boxing remains hugely popular. People enjoy action films with elaborate fight choreography. We draw different moral lines than Romans did. We insist on consent, on safety measures, on fighters who choose to participate. These distinctions matter enormously. But the underlying fascination with combat as spectacle remains recognizable across 2,000 years. The Colosseum itself has become the most visited monument in Italy, with approximately 7 million people touring it annually. They walk through passages where gladiators once waited. They stand on the arena floor imagining combats. They look at the hypogeum thinking about the machinery that created spectacle. They photograph themselves with the ruins as backdrop, posting images to social media, participating in a modern form of spectacle that would baffle Romans, but which serves some of the same purposes, demonstrating that you have traveled, that you are cultured, that you have seen important things. Tourism has become the Colosseum's purpose. It generates revenue for Italy, provides employment, contributes to Rome's economy. The building persists not despite the games ending, but because they ended a functioning amphitheatre, would be controversial, protested, possibly banned. As a ruin, as a monument to past entertainment rather than present practice, it becomes acceptable, even celebrated. We find it easier to appreciate at a distance. We can admire the engineering without endorsing what was engineered. We can acknowledge the game's importance to Roman culture without believing they were good or right. We can study them academically, discuss them intellectually, visit the sites where they occurred, all while maintaining that we would never permit such things today. This comfortable distance may be partly illusion. Our own entertainment includes elements we may struggle to defend to future generations. Our video games feature elaborate violence. Our films depict suffering in graphic detail. Our sports risk permanent brain damage. Future societies may look back at us with the same mixture of fascination and horror we direct toward Roman games. Or perhaps not. Perhaps we have genuinely progressed morally, have created ethical constraints that make contemporary violence as entertainment fundamentally different from what Romans practiced. The debate continues among philosophers and ethicists, and resolution seems distant. What remains certain is that gladiators continue serving as mirrors. Each age looks at them and sees itself, its values, its conflicts, its preoccupations. Medieval Christians saw barbarism to contrast with their faith. Renaissance humanists saw martial virtue to emulate. Enlightenment philosophers saw civilization's corruption. Romantics saw revolutionary potential. Moderns see everything from psychological insight to economic exploitation to entertainment ethics. The actual gladiators, men like Priscus and Verus, who fought to a draw for hours and were both granted freedom by a moved emperor. Like Flamma choosing to return to the arena repeatedly. Like the unnamed thousands whose bones rest in gladiator cemeteries across the former empire, these actual people become less visible with each layer of interpretation. But perhaps this was always true. Perhaps even in their own time, gladiators were symbols as much as people, representations of broader themes about courage and slavery and entertainment and power. Perhaps Romans watching combats were not really seeing individual fighters, but rather seeing what those fighters represented: Roman virtue, imperial might, cosmic order, where some command and others obey. If so, then our continued use of gladiators as symbols continues their original purpose. We still need them to mean things, to represent ideas, to serve as reference points for arguments about human nature and social organization and moral progress. We have not stopped using them, we have simply adapted them to new purposes. Our word arena derives from the Latin for sand. The gladiators fought on sand that absorbed their blood, that provided footing, that could be raked smooth to erase evidence of previous combat. Now we use arena, metaphorically the arena of politics, the arena of business, the arena of public opinion. We have kept the language while transforming the meaning, maintained the vocabulary while changing what it describes. This is fitting. Language is one form of legacy, perhaps the most persistent. Long after the Colosseum crumbles to dust, long after the last tourist visits the last ruins, people will likely still use words and concepts derived from gladiatorial culture. The metaphors will persist even when their origins are forgotten. The symbols will continue even when their referents have vanished from memory. The gladiators won a strange kind of immortality, not the immortality they sought fame during their lives, perhaps freedom, possibly comfort in old age, but immortality as myth, as symbol, as endlessly reinterpreted historical phenomenon that each generation uses for its own purposes. They fought for reasons specific to their moment because they were slaves, because they had been captured in war, because they had been condemned for crimes, occasionally because they volunteered for the wealth and fame that success could bring. They fought in sand that absorbed their blood, in amphitheaters that have mostly crumbled, for audiences who have been dead for 1700 years. But they are still here, in a sense. Still fighting, still dying, still winning occasionally, still serving purposes they never intended and could never have imagined. Still making us think about courage and cruelty, entertainment and exploitation, what it means to be human and what it means to be civilized. In the Colosseum's ruins, 250 plant species grow seeds from Africa, Asia, Europe, all flourishing together where men once died for the entertainment of crowds, life emerging from death. Beauty from horror, nature reclaiming what humans built for violence. This is the gladiators' final legacy, not what they intended, but what remained after everything they knew had passed away. The violence ended, the empire fell, the game stopped. But something persists. Memory, symbol, warning, inspiration, question mark. They force us to confront uncomfortable truths about what humans are capable of doing and watching and justifying. We cannot undo their suffering. We cannot restore their names or honor their courage or compensate for their slavery. We can only remember them, try to understand them, use their stories to illuminate both their world and ours. The sand absorbed their blood. Time absorbed their civilization. But history, imperfectly and incompletely, preserved their story. And as long as humans wonder about courage and cruelty, about entertainment and ethics, about what our societies reveal about our values, the gladiators will remain relevant. They fought in arenas of sand. Now they fight in arenas of memory and interpretation and meaning. Different combat, different stakes, but still, somehow, still fighting, still remembered, still teaching, still warning, still here,